You may be wondering which to buy first, own home or investment property. Well, in this video, I'm going to go through and demystify the kind of options that you've got when you're considering the pros and cons of investing in your first house or your first buy-to-let property. So if this sounds of interest to you, keep watching the rest of this video. Buying a property, either your first home or an investment, is going to be the biggest financial decision of your life so far, in most cases. So when doing that, you really need to weigh up the pros and cons. But first I need to talk about what you need to do in order to get the best financial advice. Now, I'm not a financial advisor, these are just my thoughts and opinions, but please do seek and look at professionals who are financial advisors, mortgage brokers, all of those kind of people who are going to help you on this journey. Don't just take my word for it. Go and back up what I'm saying and see if it's the right predicament for yourself. So first, we're going to go through the advantages of buying your own home first. Well, when buying your own home first, you've got a few things to think about. But I'll go back to one of the key things that I learned over time is seeing a property as an asset or liability. Now, the first thing, when it's in your own home or the column of your own home, say that we're going to have two columns in assets and liabilities, and it would sit on the liability end because it's your own house. The reason you looking at it as a liability is because anything that doesn't produce you money is a liability. Whereas obviously you can benefit from capital appreciation from the house, but you still need to consider it, the fact that you're paying out month in, month out, then it is a liability because it's not putting money in your pocket right then, and that's a cash flowing asset. So it is a liability in that regard, but it does allow you some flexibilities. When buying a property for yourself and to live in, you might look at how you could do it up a bit slower, so that's an advantage. So maybe the property needs a renovation, you could do it up and live in it, and then do the renovations as you're going along over time, build up the capital growth in the property as you're doing it. So that's another benefit of doing it. The other point is that there is no capital gains on the real value added. So when you've been adding value, maybe you've added renovations, maybe you had an extension, maybe the capital growth of the property, you're not going to pay capital gains because you're living in that property. Whereas if it was a investment and you'd added value and then you look to flip it, then you would be subject to capital gains. So that's one thing that you need to think about, is if you are buying an investment property, when you buy and sell that property and you're selling it for a profit, that is going to be subject to capital gains. Whereas if it's your own home, that's not going to be an issue. So that's a key benefit there if you are buying your own home as an investment case. Overall, you're going to need less deposit. So if you are buying on a typical mortgage for a first time buyer, then would be 5% at the moment due to the 5% mortgage scheme. But otherwise, it's still only 10% in most cases for the deposit down. So when you compare that to a buy-to-let, then it is a stark comparison, because if you're going for a typical buy-to-let product, that would be 25% deposit down. So obviously a lot more than being put down, over twice as much being put down as a deposit. So maybe you can get in a bit easier with your own home and buying it that way. Another aspect is that you don't have to do the typical white walls, grey carpet. Now, in every renovation that we do white walls and grey carpet, but you can add a bit of flair when it's your own property. You can do things that are a bit different. So when you think about it, I could have yellow walls and all sorts of stuff like that. Typically, if you're looking at HMOs, they go a bit more fancy with their decorating and whatnot. But if you're doing your own house, you can look and put some nuances in there that may be more beneficial for more of aesthetic pleasing to you. But you can do things like that and you have more control over it. Whereas if it's a buy-to-let, you're going to do basically a blank canvas and they're going to put in their own stamp in it. So this is why we just go in white walls, grey carpet, and then they'll do their own thing. The thing I really don't like them doing is putting wallpaper on the walls, and that is in the tenancy agreement, I think. Don't put any wallpaper on the walls. Warning, never let them put wallpaper on the walls. It is a nightmare if you've got to get it off, and you can cause yourself even more cost to replaster. So just a side note for that one. I did to this earlier, but take advantage of first time buyer schemes. There are lots of schemes out there. Just one of them I mentioned was the 5% deposit scheme. So if you're going on a 5% deposit scheme, you can go out and buy twice as much property as you were able to before, but obviously you need to be able to cover the mortgage. So one of the things that you need to look at is my criteria that I'm currently under gonna suit me for a mortgage that's gonna be double the price. So it's all about what you can cover, and it's all about mortgage coverage as well. are you going to be able to afford it? And that's going to be on affordability means testing from the mortgage company. So obviously that really depends on what you can afford, and they'll assess that in due course. So I've heard of some situations where people are buying their own home and that's what they do, and I mentioned about renovating and getting it up to standard, but that could be a key point that you might want to go under and start renovating properties whilst you're living in them, get the value from it for a few years, and then upscale, then do it again, upscale, then do it again. Some people have tried this and it's an absolute nightmare to renovate whilst you're living in the house, but it might be something that you might want to endure, and it's kind of one of those personal preferences again. The next thing, having your own home provides you greater control, and not in the sense that you might think. So when comparing it to a investment property, one thing is if you get behind on the bills, it's your liability. You have the control of what happens. Yes, things can happen, and I say that, you know, even if you get in that kind of position, at least it's you and it's not someone else and them owing you money, because I think that as long as you have control to do something about it. But if somebody's not paying you, it's a really hard slog to get them out of the property if they're not paying and they're in arrears. Whereas if it's yourself, then obviously you have control of that, and it's a personal preference to me that I'd rather have control over the asset and how much I'm paying out. But then again, at least with a mortgage, you know that it's being covered and it's not coming out of your pocket. So there are pros and cons to that. It's just really a personal preference in that regard. When you're buying your own home, essentially it's just dead money going out. It's not making any money for you, and that goes back to the point that this is a liability at the end of the day. So you do really need to consider that, because look at it, if you know that it's going to be a liability, and it's one of those things where it's a personal preference, you really need to understand what are the kind of personal implications for yourself of having this liability. Although it is something that a lot of people find extra levels of security with, knowing that they've got an asset that they own and they live in. Whereas if it's something like a buy to let, they might not feel that level of security. So if anything was to happen and you own the house outright and clear, then they haven't got any mortgage or anything like that and they just live in it, it can take a lot of financial burden off, that you don't have to pay anything out. So some people like to have that free and clear asset that they own, but again, it's still a liability because you are paying out of pocket for it, whereas all of the other things would have been covered then by the tenant. So it's just one thing to consider. It's more of a personal preference in that regard. Now comes the case for an investment. Really, this is one of the things that I would personally suggest, and for the reasons I'm going to share with you now. But if you're looking at it, it's got some key advantages over buying your own home first. When you are targeting which property you want to buy, it might be that when you're investing in a property, it might not be an area that you are invested in locally. It could be further afield. So for example, if I was in London and I invested in a property in South Wales, I could look at buying there because it was cheaper, and that would be my buy-to-let property, whereas I couldn't afford a London property. So if I was in that kind of situation, I would then look at purchasing a buy-to-let first. I've got more capital to put down to be able to do that, whereas it would cost me way too much if I was going to do it in London. So as an example of that, maybe that's a better option, because it would take you far longer to save for an investment maybe in London as opposed to buying a buy-to-let. Wait. Like, comment and subscribe, and let me know below in the comments what's been the biggest advantage to you. So then you would target properties for potential capital growth and yield. Those things that you want to look at, and obviously this would check into the asset column because it's something that's going to be paying you month in, month out. Whereas obviously the other option of buying your first home would be a liability. So when you're looking at that asset liability all the way, I'm thinking already this is kind of starting to sway things when I try and put more ticks in my asset column than I do my liability column. There is a certain level of flexibility as well, because you don't have to purchase based on what you can afford. So what you can do is look at it based on mortgage capability. So at the time when I was buying my first buy-to-let, if I was going to do it, would I have bought it with a mortgage for my own first house? Might not have, because I was self-employed and all these other things. Was it a better option? I didn't have those kind of pay levels because I'm paying myself in a business. So me trying to evidence when I pay myself the minimum threshold, is that really going to work? No, not really. So when you look at it, on a buy-to-let, they're looking at the property more specifically and how much could be afforded by the rental income. So that is looking at you as separate entities in a certain sense. As long as you've got a certain amount of money and you've got show that you're in positive as opposed to negative when it comes to investing, that's the main criteria. As long as it's not particularly bad. At the time I had really good credit score as well. So even then, I don't know whether I would have struggled to get a first-time buyer's mortgage. Maybe I would have, maybe I wouldn't have. But those are things that you need to consider. Whereas I've heard of a lot of people who are successful business owners who can't get a mortgage, but they could get an investment. So look at those kind of things. Maybe it's a criteria situation. Maybe you wouldn't be able to afford it. And as I said, in London properties, maybe that coverage has got to be a lot higher because you're going for a much bigger asset value. Well, maybe you wouldn't cover it. So something like that is something you want to really consider when going into this and knowing if you're going to buy your first home or an investment property based on that. If you don't want to look at that criteria, it's a lot easier to get a buy-to-let mortgage for that reason. You could look at other potential high cash flowing strategies. So if you were having your own first home, then you wouldn't be able to look at things like service accommodation. Maybe you wouldn't look at a HMO. Maybe you wouldn't look at buying multiple flats at a time. Those are the things that you need to consider. There might be things that could yield a lot better, but if you were having your own home and your first home, then those wouldn't afford those to you and it would still be a liability. But obviously we're talking high yielding strategies that might not be an option to you, which even those kind of strategies could be a job-based income and could get you out of your job if that and you want to do that and it's in that position. Then that might be an option for you. Now, I mentioned buying a property, then doing it up, but you can buy a real wreck, something that's not mortgageable potentially, and that could be something that you really want to do. So you might buy a property that is unmortgageable at the current state and then do that up. Those are properties you can get on BMV, below market value. So you can check out another video I did right here where I've got to talk about BMV properties. That might be an option for you. But when you are doing it up, you don't have to go and potch about doing one room at a time. Like if you were doing it, do up your own home as an investment as well at the same time and living in it, then it would be a slower process in most cases because you got to move around. Whereas you could get your team in, the build team in, and they could just renovate that property and then get it sorted in one chunk. Whereas if you were doing it as first property, then that might not be an option for you and might need to do it over a slower process. And you might have to even go out and live in a hotel for a bit and all sorts of stuff because of key things like plumbing being shut off or all these other kind of things that you might run into. So you really need to think about these when you are buying. If it's a serious renovation that you're going to be doing, you might not be able to live in the property at those times, so you've got to factor those in as a cost. Ultimately, the biggest benefit of buying an investment over your first property to live in is, I would say, the fact that the tenant is going to pay the mortgage. Now, they are paying for an asset for you as opposed to you having to pay for this liability, although it is kind of borderline and something that is obviously going to appreciate. But again, because we're basically being binary and we're saying, okay, asset, liability, is it paying me, is it not paying me, then it's still a liability. So considering that, this is definitely going in the asset column. It's paying down the mortgage, and that's the key benefit. Somebody else is paying for your asset. That is the ideal outcome that you have. So when deploying money into an investment, you can get your capital work harder for you. So what I mean by that is when you're looking at investment case, you might be able to get it to stretch even further because it's going to really start growing if you buy it in the right areas. And that might be something that you really need to look at in terms of your investment case. So getting that capital to work harder for you, not only because you're adding value in some regards, but you could be buying below market value, you could be doing all other strategies there that you could implement to really get that capital to work. Possibly one of the biggest advantages of getting an investment over getting your own property first is the freedom of it. So if I was to buy my first property and I was living in it, well, the issue is that you're kind of tied to it. I mean, I can't just go anywhere and live anywhere I want to. I've got to go and sell that asset first before I can get another one. So when you think about it, if I had to move because of my job or whatever that is, then I'm pretty tied. I've got to sell the asset to go and buy another asset, or even if there is the option of obviously leaving that property, then turning it into a buy-to-let. But it is still a bit stuck because you might need the capital and to go and buy another place. If that's going to be your strategy, then it might not work for you. But with a buy-to-let investment, then what you can do is you can leave the country even, and that property will still continue to pay you. So you're not dependent on being in the same location as the property. So it's completely independent, and it's freedom at its finest. So you don't not tied to that asset, and it's an asset that's going to pay you and continue to pay you for as long as that tenant is paying down that mortgage and giving you their rent. There is, however, a third option, and that's living in your investment property. Now, if you were doing that, you could live in a HMO. A HMO would be a property with over 3 other lodges. But the problem you've got is that if it's an Article 4 area, then you would need a license for that HMO. So if you've got a licensed HMO area, then you would have to adhere to different rules. So anything over 2 people would be classed as a HMO. But if you were to live in the property, even with your family who are related, then, and that's their definition, they gotta be related, they would then be able to live in the property along with yourself and 2 other lodgers. Now this might be another option of then having an investment property and being your first property. So you could live in it whilst having 2 other lodgers. They would essentially be able to pay for the mortgage for you, depending on obviously the prices, but that could cover the mortgage for you, and you could even make a bit of money in the process. So that might be an option for you. The other option then might be that you live in the property whilst then taking it out on service accommodation. So you could then rent a room to Airbnb or Booking.com or whatever it is, and you might have a few rooms in that property. You could do that whilst living in the same place. So that might be another option. So you can accelerate your yield at the same time, so you're getting an extra money. And this can give you other higher yielding opportunities for investing. So they're just a couple of options that you can do, which is the hybrid option, which is option 3. So depending on your situation, that might work for you. So that is your third option. That could be a really good option for you, depending on the area you live in. It typically lends itself more to cities or seaside locations. Those might be more of a better option. But if you can do that, then you can invest and get your first property at the same time. So which option would you choose? If you were going for this, there's 3 options. Let me know in the comments below. So you know what it is by now. I give you some pros and cons and some personal opinion, and you make your own decision. So if you are getting value from this video, please like, comment, and subscribe, and let us know what has been the biggest benefit to you